My neighbor Ruth stopped me in my own driveway on a Tuesday afternoon, put her hand gently on my arm, the way you'd touch someone you were worried about, and asked me a question that stopped me cold. "Stanley, how are you really doing? Renee mentioned you've been having some memory troubles lately. I just want you to know we're all here for you if you need anything."
I stood there in my driveway, garden hose still in my hand, watering the tomatoes I'd planted myself just 3 weeks earlier, the same variety Carol and I had grown together for over 20 summers. And I had absolutely no idea what Ruth was talking about. I hadn't had a single memory lapse worth mentioning. I certainly hadn't discussed any such thing with my daughter, Renee, or with anyone else in my life.
I want to tell you exactly what I discovered over the following 6 weeks, because my own daughter had been quietly building a narrative about my mental decline for months, sharing it with neighbors, extended family, even, as I eventually learned, with my own doctor's office. And she'd been doing all of this for a reason considerably more calculated than simple concern.
My name is Stanley. I'm 70 years old. And this is the story of the 6 weeks I spent gathering proof of my own mental competence, after discovering my daughter had spent nearly a year quietly convincing everyone around me that I was losing my mind. If you've ever discovered that someone close to you was quietly building a false narrative about your own capabilities, stay with me until the end. Because what I found and what it revealed about my daughter's actual intentions is something I still have trouble fully accepting even now. And if these kinds of stories matter to you, hit subscribe, because there's more where this came from. Let me take you back to where this actually started, because understanding the full timeline matters considerably to what eventually happened. My wife, Carol, passed 3 years ago. A sudden stroke that took her within a matter of hours. No real warning, no chance for either of us to say the kinds of things people imagine they'll get to say at the end of a long marriage. We'd been married 43 years. After she died, I stayed in the house we'd shared for over 3 decades, a modest 4-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood where I'd lived long enough to know most of my neighbors by name, Ruth included, a woman who'd lived 2 doors down from us for over 15 years and had genuinely become a close friend to both Carol and me.
Over that time,
I remember the specific morning of Carol's stroke with a clarity that hasn't dimmed at all in 3 years, the way certain traumatic memories seem to resist the ordinary erosion of time. We'd been having coffee together, an entirely ordinary Tuesday morning, discussing nothing more significant than whether we needed to replace the gutters before the fall rain started, when she simply stopped mid-sentence, her coffee cup tilting slightly in her hand. I knew, within seconds, that something was catastrophically wrong, though I didn't yet have the vocabulary for what I was witnessing.
By the time the ambulance arrived, she was already unconscious, and she never regained consciousness before she passed 6 hours later at the hospital. I mention this specific memory because I think it matters to understanding why Renee's fear, however misguided its eventual expression became, wasn't entirely irrational. She'd watched her mother disappear in the space of a single Tuesday morning, and some part of her, I came to understand later, had never fully recovered from the specific terror of how suddenly a beloved parent could simply be gone.
I have 2 children. My son, Marcus, lives about 4 hours away, works as an engineer, and while our relationship has always been warm, distance has naturally limited how frequently we see each other, typically holidays and perhaps 1 or 2 additional visits throughout the year. My daughter Renee lives about 20 minutes from me, and in the years following Carol's death, she became, understandably, my primary day-to-day connection to family, visiting regularly,
helping me navigate the particular loneliness of adjusting to life alone after 4 decades of marriage. I want to be fair to Renee in describing the years immediately following Carol's death, because fairness matters in a story like this one. She was, in many genuine ways, wonderful during that period. She helped me sort through Carol's belongings, a process that took the better part of a year, and that I genuinely couldn't have managed alone. She called frequently, checked in without being asked, brought her 2 children over regularly so I could maintain a relationship with my grandchildren that felt meaningful rather than obligatory. I remember specific Saturdays during that first year, Renee arriving with boxes and packing tape, the 2 of us working through Carol's closet together, Renee handling most of the emotional weight of decisions I found myself unable to make alone. Which dresses to donate, which jewelry to keep for her own daughter someday, which of Carol's handwritten recipe cards deserved a place in a keepsake box rather than the general donation pile. I remember more than once, both of us simply sitting on the closet floor crying together, surrounded by 4 decades of my wife's belongings. And I want to be honest that those specific memories make everything that happened later considerably harder to reconcile, because the daughter who sat with me on that floor was, in every observable way, the same daughter who would later fabricate an entire narrative about my cognitive decline. But somewhere around the 18-month mark after Carol's passing, I began noticing small shifts in how Renee discussed certain topics with me. Shifts I initially dismissed as simple daughterly concern, but that in hindsight formed the early foundation of something considerably more calculated than I understood at the time. It started with small, seemingly innocuous comments about my daily habits. "Dad, did you remember to pay the electric bill this month? I noticed it seemed a little later than usual." I had, in fact, paid the bill on time, exactly as I always had, but I didn't think much of the question beyond simple daughterly attentiveness. A few weeks later, another comment. "Dad, you mentioned the same story about your fishing trip with Uncle Raid twice this week. Just wanted to check in on that." I genuinely didn't remember repeating myself, though I also didn't think it was particularly unusual, the way any person might occasionally repeat a favorite story without realizing it, especially someone recently widowed who found comfort in certain familiar memories. I want to be honest about something. At 70 years old, I do experience the ordinary, unremarkable forgetfulness that comes with normal aging, occasionally misplacing my keys, needing an extra moment to recall a specific word during conversation, forgetting why I'd walked into a particular room before remembering a moment later. These are, as my doctor would later confirm explicitly, entirely normal experiences for someone my age, distinct in every meaningful clinical sense from any genuine cognitive decline. But I didn't fully understand during those early months how Renee was apparently beginning to catalog and characterize these ordinary moments as evidence of something considerably more serious. I want to give a specific example of how this pattern played out, because I think it illustrates exactly how ordinary moments got transformed into something else entirely. One afternoon, about a year after Carol's death, I misplaced my car keys for perhaps 20 minutes, eventually finding them in the pocket of a jacket I'd worn the previous day, rather than their usual spot by the front door. It was, by any reasonable measure, an entirely unremarkable event, the kind of minor inconvenience that happens to people of every age with some regularity. I mentioned it to Renee in passing. I later learned from that same nurse's note at Dr. Holloway's office that this exact incident had been reported to my doctor's office as significant difficulty locating personal items, potentially indicative of early cognitive changes, a characterization so far removed from the actual mundane reality of the event that I struggled, upon learning about it, to understand how the 2 versions could possibly describe the same 20 minutes of my, about a year after Carol's death,
Renee began raising the subject of my long-term planning with increasing frequency. Initially framed as reasonable, practical concern, had I updated my will since Carol passed? Did I have a healthcare proxy designated? Had I considered what would happen to the house if I ever needed additional support? These conversations gradually shifted toward a more specific, and, I eventually understood, more troubling direction.
Dad, I really think we should talk about getting some kind of formal arrangement in place, she said during one dinner conversation about 14 months after Carol's death. Just in case anything ever happens where you need help making decisions, it would give me real peace of mind knowing everything was properly set up. I told her, at the time, that I appreciated her concern, but didn't feel any particular urgency about it, that I remained entirely capable of managing my own affairs, and would revisit the conversation if circumstances genuinely changed. She accepted this answer at the time, at least on the surface, though I noticed, looking back, a particular quality to her acceptance that suggested the conversation was far from over in her own mind.
I want to describe the specific incident that first raised genuine alarm for me, because it happened about 3 weeks before Ruth's comment in my driveway, and it should have told me considerably more than I initially understood. I'd stopped by Marcus's house for an unplanned visit during a business trip that brought him briefly through the area, and during our conversation, he mentioned, almost in passing, a call he'd received from Renee about 2 months earlier. She mentioned you'd been getting a little forgetful, Dad. Said you'd left the stove on once and gotten confused about a doctor's appointment. I told her it was probably nothing serious, but she seemed pretty concerned about it.
I stood in Marcus's kitchen, genuinely confused myself, though for entirely different reasons than what Renee had apparently described. I had never left the stove on. I had never missed or been confused about a doctor's appointment. I asked Marcus directly what specifically Renee had said, and while his memory of the conversation was somewhat vague, given that it had happened months earlier and hadn't seemed at the time urgent enough to discuss with me directly, he confirmed that Renee had characterized several specific incidents, none of which I had any actual memory of experiencing myself.
This is where the timeline becomes important to understand clearly. I began, from that conversation with Marcus onward, paying much closer attention to how Renee discussed me with others, and to what specifically she might be building toward.
About 2 weeks after that conversation with Marcus, I discovered, entirely by accident, something that shifted my understanding of the situation considerably. I'd stopped by my primary care physician's office, Dr. Holloway, for a routine appointment, unrelated to any cognitive concerns, and during the visit, the nurse mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd noted the concerns your daughter raised in her call last month, and asked whether I'd like to schedule a formal cognitive assessment as a precaution.
I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, sitting in that examination room, genuinely confused about what call the nurse was referencing. I asked her directly to clarify, and she explained, somewhat uncomfortably once she realized I hadn't been aware of the situation, that Renee had called the office approximately 6 weeks earlier, describing several specific incidents of concerning forgetfulness and confusion, requesting that the practice flag my chart for closer monitoring, and suggesting specifically that a formal cognitive evaluation might be warranted, given what she'd described as.
I asked Dr. Holloway directly, once he joined the appointment, what exactly had been documented based on Renee's call. He pulled up the note, somewhat reluctantly given the sensitivity of the situation, and read through several specific incidents Renee had described: confusion about medication schedules, difficulty recognizing familiar neighbors, a specific claim that I'd gotten lost driving to a location I'd visited hundreds of times before. None of these incidents had actually happened. I want to be entirely clear about that. I had never confused my medications, which in truth consisted of a single daily blood pressure prescription I'd managed without incident for over a decade. I had never failed to recognize a neighbor. I had certainly never gotten lost driving anywhere in a town I'd lived in for over 30 years. I left that appointment deeply unsettled, and it was only 3 weeks later, standing in my own driveway with a garden hose in my hand, that Ruth's comment finally revealed how far this fabricated narrative had actually spread beyond just my doctor's office. I want to tell you about the conversation I had with Ruth that afternoon, because her response, once I explained my genuine confusion, provided crucial additional information about exactly what Renee had been telling people.
"Stanley, I'm confused now too," Ruth said, her earlier concern shifting towards something more troubled as she began to understand my genuine bewilderment. "Renee stopped by my house about a month ago, said she was worried about you, mentioned you'd had some kind of confused episode where you'd forgotten how to get home from the grocery store and she'd had to come get you. She asked if I'd noticed anything unusual myself, said she just wanted extra eyes looking out for you, given everything you'd been through since Carol passed." I told Ruth the truth, as plainly as I could manage while still processing my own shock at what I was hearing. I had never experienced any such episode. I had never called Renee for help finding my way home from anywhere. This entire narrative, apparently spreading across my doctor's office, my son, and now evidently my neighbors, was being constructed entirely without my knowledge, or more troublingly, without any actual basis in reality.
I want to tell you about the following several days, because I spent them initially in a state of genuine confusion rather than anger, trying to understand what could possibly motivate my daughter to fabricate an entire pattern of cognitive decline that simply hadn't happened.
I called Renee directly, keeping my tone as neutral and non-accusatory as I could manage, and asked her simply whether she'd been discussing concerns about my memory with people in my life. She hesitated, just slightly, before answering. A hesitation I noticed clearly, given how closely I was now paying attention to every detail of our conversation.
"Dad, I've just been worried about you," she said. "Since Mom passed, I've noticed some changes, and I wanted to make sure the people around you were paying attention too, in case something serious was actually happening that you might not fully recognize in yourself." "Renee," I said, "I need you to give me specific examples, not general impressions, specific incidents with dates of times you've actually witnessed confusion or memory problems." There was a long pause on the line. "I don't have specific dates memorized, Dad. It's just been a general pattern I've noticed."
I want to explain why that answer troubled me as much as it did. If genuine observed incidents had actually been occurring, Renee should have been able to describe them with at least some specificity: a particular Tuesday, a particular conversation, a particular moment where actual confusion had genuinely manifested. Instead, what I was hearing was vague, general impression dressed up as documented concern, precisely the kind of narrative that, repeated often enough to enough different people, could construct a compelling picture of decline without any of it being rooted in actual.
I decided at that point to pursue something considerably more formal and objective than continued conversation with Renee herself. I scheduled a comprehensive cognitive evaluation with a neuropsychologist, a careful, thorough woman named Dr. Adora Bello, specifically chosen because she had no prior connection to my family and no access to whatever narrative Renee had already constructed with my regular physician's office.
I want to describe that evaluation process in some detail, because I think the thoroughness of it matters to understanding just how definitively it addressed the situation.
Dr. Bellows' assessment took nearly 4 hours, spread across 2 separate sessions, involving standardized cognitive testing across multiple domains: memory, executive function, processing speed, language, visuospatial reasoning. I completed extensive questionnaires about my daily functioning, my medical history, my family history of any cognitive conditions. Dr. Bellow also conducted a lengthy, structured interview, asking
detailed questions about my daily routines, my financial management, my social relationships, specifically probing for any evidence of the kind of functional decline that typically accompanies genuine cognitive impairment.
I remember sitting in Dr. Bellows' waiting room before that first session, feeling a strange, almost surreal nervousness, the specific anxiety of someone who knows, intellectually, that they should perform perfectly normally on an upcoming test, but who also understands that anxiety itself can sometimes interfere with performance, regardless of underlying ability. I found myself, in an odd way, more nervous walking into that assessment than I'd been for most significant events in my adult life, aware that whatever emerged from those 4 hours would carry considerably more weight than an
ordinary doctor's visit, given everything riding on the outcome. Dr. Bellow, sensing my nervousness, spent the first 20 minutes simply talking with me informally before any formal testing began, explaining her process clearly, answering my questions about what the various tests actually measured, helping me settle into something closer to my normal state before the more structured portions of the assessment began.
The results, delivered in a comprehensive written report about 2 weeks after the final testing session, were unambiguous. My cognitive functioning across every tested domain fell within the normal range for my age, with several areas, including verbal memory and executive function, scoring above average compared to age-matched peers. Dr. Bellows' report specifically noted, in careful clinical language, that there was no evidence whatsoever of cognitive impairment, mild or otherwise, and that my daily functioning based on both testing and structured interview reflected someone fully capable.
I want to tell you what I did with that report, because I approached the situation carefully rather than simply confronting Renee with accusations. I requested a family meeting, including Renee, Marcus, who drove in specifically for the occasion once I explained the situation over the phone, and, at my request, Dr. Halloway, my primary care physician, whose office had been drawn in to Renee's fabricated narrative without their own independent verification.
I want to describe that meeting in detail, because it unfolded in stages that I think matter to understanding the full picture. I began by presenting Dr. Bellows' comprehensive report, distributing copies to everyone present, walking through the specific findings clearly and without editorializing, simply letting the clinical language speak for itself. I watched Renee's face as she read through the document, moving from what looked like genuine surprise to something more complicated as she began to understand the implications of what she was reading.
I'd chosen to hold that meeting at my own kitchen table, the same table where Renee and I had shared countless ordinary meals over the years, deliberately rather than in some more formal or confrontational setting, because I wanted the conversation to happen somewhere that still felt like family, rather than like an interrogation. I'd made coffee beforehand, the same way I always had when family visited, a small gesture toward normalcy that felt important to me, even as I understood the conversation we were about to have was anything but normal. Dr. Halloway arrived a few minutes after Marcus.
"I need to understand something," I said, once everyone had finished reviewing the report. "Renee has been telling people, Marcus, Ruth, my own doctor's office, about specific incidents of confusion and memory decline that, as far as I can determine, never actually happened. I need to understand why."
Marcus, sitting beside me, looked genuinely troubled. glancing between Renee and me with an expression suggesting he was only now beginning to fully process the discrepancy between what he'd been told months earlier and what the report in his hands actually demonstrated. Renee was quiet for a long moment before she finally spoke, and what she said revealed a motivation considerably more calculated than I'd initially imagined, though also, I want to be honest, more understandable in its underlying anxiety than I expected.
"Dad, I need you to understand something about my perspective," she said, her voice tight with what sounded like genuine distress rather than simple defensiveness. "After Mom died, I became terrified of something happening to you too, suddenly, without warning, the way it did with her. I started reading about cognitive decline, about how families often miss early warning signs because they're too close to the situation to see it clearly. I convinced myself that ordinary things, forgetting a story you'd told before, misplacing your keys, might actually be early signs of something serious. That I needed to document and prepare for, even if you yourself weren't recognizing it. But Renee," I said, "you described specific incidents that never happened, getting lost driving somewhere familiar, confusion about medication, a call where you had to help me find my way home from the grocery store. Those aren't misinterpretations of ordinary forgetfulness. Those are fabrications."
This is where the conversation shifted toward something more difficult, and I want to be honest about how it unfolded rather than simplifying it into something cleaner than it actually was. Renee acknowledged, slowly and with visible difficulty, that she had in fact exaggerated and in some cases entirely invented specific incidents, initially telling herself she was simply rounding up ordinary, ambiguous moments into a clearer pattern that would help her get the people around me to pay closer attention, a justification that, once actually said out loud in that room, sounded considerably
thinner than it apparently had inside her own head over the preceding months.
But there was a second layer to her motivation that emerged more slowly during that conversation, one that troubled me considerably more than the initial explanation. Renee, it turned out, had also been quietly researching guardianship proceedings, consulting briefly with an attorney about what would be required to establish a legal framework where she could make financial and medical decisions on my behalf, framing this research to herself as prudent, protective planning rather than what it actually represented, building a case, however unconsciously at first, for taking control of my
affairs based on a narrative of decline she herself had constructed rather than genuinely observed.
Marcus, hearing this specific detail for the first time alongside me, sat back in his chair with an expression of genuine shock, and I watched him process the fact that his sister had taken concrete legal steps based on a narrative he himself had unknowingly helped spread, simply by repeating what she told him months earlier, without ever independently verifying it. "Renee," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of hurt and disbelief. "You had me telling neighbors and family friends about things that never happened. I trusted what you told me completely, because why would I ever think to
question it?" This moment, I think, mattered as much to Renee's eventual reckoning with what she'd done as anything I said directly. Because Marcus's genuine hurt at having been unknowingly recruited into spreading her fabrication carried a different weight than my own confrontation, coming as it did from a sibling rather than a parent.
I want to tell you what I felt hearing this, because it was more complicated than simple anger. Part of me understood, even in that difficult moment, that Renee's underlying fear was genuine. The terror of losing a parent suddenly, the way she'd lost her mother, without any warning or opportunity to prepare,
was a real and understandable anxiety given what our family had actually experienced. But understanding the underlying fear didn't excuse the specific, deliberate choice to fabricate evidence and quietly explore legal mechanisms to take control of my life based on that fabrication.
Rather than addressing her fear directly and honestly with me. I want to tell you about the weeks that followed, because the resolution here required considerably more than a single difficult family meeting. I formalized, with Dr. Holloway's full awareness and cooperation, a clear correction to my medical record, ensuring Dr. Bellows' comprehensive evaluation was permanently documented alongside a formal note clarifying that the previous concerns raised by Renee had not been substantiated by objective clinical assessment. I also reached out personally to Ruth and several other neighbors and family friends who I learned over the following weeks had received similar concerning characterizations from Renee, sharing Dr. Bellows' findings directly and clearly, correcting a narrative that had
discovered, spread considerably further than I initially understood. I want to be honest that this process of correction felt in its own way almost as difficult as discovering the fabrication in the first place. The specific discomfort of having to actively defend my own mental competence to neighbors and friends who had, through no fault of their own, simply believed what my own daughter had told them.
I remember the conversation with Ruth specifically, sitting on her back porch with Dr. Bellows' report between us, watching her expression shift from her original concern into something closer to genuine embarrassment on Renee's behalf. "Stanley, I'm so sorry," she said. "I should have talked to you directly instead of just believing what Renee told me. I think I assumed a daughter wouldn't exaggerate something like that, and I never considered that she might be, even if not entirely consciously, telling me something that wasn't true." I appreciated Ruth's honesty in that moment, though I also found myself, in the weeks that followed, having several similar conversations with other neighbors and family friends, each one requiring me to walk through the same explanation, the same clinical report, the same patient correction of a narrative that had spread further than I'd initially realized. Renee and I had several additional conversations over the following 2 months, considerably more difficult and honest than anything we'd discussed in the years since Carol's death. She began seeing a therapist, something she'd never done before, specifically working through what she came to understand as a complicated grief response, the sudden loss of her mother triggering a hypervigilance, almost obsessive fear about losing me as well. A fear that had, without her fully recognizing it happening, transformed into a pattern of fabrication and quiet legal maneuvering that bore little actual relationship to my genuine well-being. I want to describe one of those later conversations in a bit more detail, because it happened about 6 weeks after the initial family meeting and marked, I think, a genuine turning point in how Renee and I related to each other going forward. We were sitting on my back patio, the same tomatoes from that earlier driveway conversation, now fully grown and nearly ready for harvest. And Renee told me something she hadn't been able to articulate during the more formal, difficult meeting with Marcus and Dr. Holloway present. "Dad, I think part of what scared me most wasn't really about your memory at all," she said. "I think I was terrified of becoming irrelevant to your life, the way I sometimes felt Mom made me feel irrelevant to hers in her final years, when her illness became the center of everything. I think some distorted part of me wanted to be needed, wanted to be the one who saw something everyone else missed, and I built an entire narrative around that need, without ever honestly examining where it was actually coming from. I found that admission
delivered quietly among the tomato plants Carol and I had first started growing together decades earlier, more affecting than,
"I think I convinced myself I was protecting you," she told me during one of these later conversations, when really, I think I was trying to protect myself from a fear I never actually dealt with honestly after Mom died. It was easier to focus on managing a crisis I invented than to simply sit with how scared I actually was of losing you too. I appreciated that honesty, though I want to be clear that appreciating it didn't mean immediately restoring the level of trust that had existed before I discovered what she'd been doing. I formalized with my attorney clear legal protections against any future guardianship attempt, a comprehensive, notarized statement of my current competence, updated regularly, along with clear documentation naming Marcus, rather than Renee, as my designated healthcare proxy and financial power of attorney should any genuine future incapacity ever occur. A decision that was, I want to be honest, as much about protecting myself as it was a direct consequence of what Renee's fabrication had revealed about her judgment under the pressure of her own unaddressed fear.
It's been about 10 months now since that conversation in my driveway with Ruth. My relationship with Renee is considerably more honest than it was before, though it required a great deal of difficult, ongoing work to arrive at that honesty. She still visits regularly, and our conversations now include a level of directness about her fears and anxieties that simply didn't exist in the years before I discovered what she'd been doing. I think, in some strange way, this entire difficult experience forced a kind of honesty between us that Carol's sudden death alone hadn't managed to produce.
I still tend my garden every summer, the same tomatoes I was watering the day Ruth first asked me that unsettling question in my driveway. I think about that afternoon often, the specific disorientation of being asked with genuine, gentle concern about a decline that had never actually happened, constructed entirely by someone who loved me, but had let an unaddressed fear metastasize into something considerably more damaging than she'd ever intended.
I think, too, about Dr. Bellow's report, still filed carefully among my important papers. A formal, clinical document confirming something I already knew about myself, but that I never imagined I'd need to formally prove to the people closest to me. I keep it not out of lingering anger, but as a reminder of how easily a narrative, repeated often enough, with sufficient apparent concern, can begin to reshape how others perceive you, regardless of how disconnected that narrative might be from the actual observable truth of who you are and what you're genuinely capable of. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to defend your own competence or capability against a narrative someone else constructed about you, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And if you want to know what happened when Renee finally told Marcus the full truth about the guardianship research she'd quietly conducted, and how that conversation reshaped their own relationship as siblings, that's a story too. Let me know.
One final thought before I close this out. Dr. Bellow told me something during our final session together, once she'd delivered the completed report, that I carried with me since. "Stanley," she said, "the saddest cases I see in this line of work aren't usually the ones where genuine decline goes unnoticed. They're the ones where a family member's own unprocessed fear ends up doing more damage to a relationship than the feared decline itself ever could have." I think about that often now, tending my garden, watching my grandchildren grow, grateful, in the end, that whatever damage Renee's
fear caused, it happened early enough and was corrected thoroughly enough that we were able to find our way back to something honest together, rather than letting an invented crisis quietly determine the shape of both our lives. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one.